The morning of June 15, 1904, dawned with a warm breeze drifting through the streets of New York as the sun slowly began illuminating the towering structures of Manhattan's Lower East Side. In the heart of Kleindeutschland, also known as Little Germany, families stirred in their tenement apartments, dressing in crisp white dresses, pressed trousers, and polished shoes. The air buzzed with the community's excitement. It was a special day, the annual and long-anticipated church outing to Long Island, a much-needed escape from the crowded city streets. Mothers adjusted bonnets on their daughters, fastening the ribbons tighter to protect against the summer breeze. Boys, dressed in their best suspenders, chased each other down the stairwells, laughing, eager to spend the day on an adventure with their friends. The sidewalks were bustling with conversations. Some spoke English with German accents, while others conversed in German, all united in anticipation of the day ahead. As they neared the East River, the General Slocum came into view, a proud white sidewheel steamer, its flags snapping in the breeze. Families gathered at the pier, waving to neighbors, their baskets filled with sausages, fresh bread, and homemade cakes. The ship's crew bustled about, securing ropes, calling out instructions. As soon as the gangplank was lowered, the children began running ahead. With a deep whistle, the General Slocum pulled from the dock, churning the water as it made its way up the river. Music was playing, laughter echoed across the decks. Women fanned themselves in the June heat, while children peered over the railing, watching the city shrink behind them. As the steamer glided along the East River, the warm June air carried the scent of salt and smoke from the city's factories. For a moment, the breeze shifted, cooler than before, sending a ripple through the flags overhead, an omen unnoticed in the day's excitement. Unseen in the shadows below deck, something smoldered. A stray spark, perhaps from the boiler, perhaps from a discarded match, landed in a forgotten pile of straw and oil-soaked rags. Slowly, in the stale darkness, embers glowed to life, feeding on the ship's neglect. Above, laughter and music drowned out the first whispers of disaster. The General Slocum carried over 1,000 souls upriver, unaware that fire had already begun its deadly ascent. At first, no one above noticed the creeping tendrils of smoke, but as the flames spread, panic followed. A mother clutched her child, eyes wide with terror. A crewman shouted for water, but none came, but the hoses crumbled in their hand due to extensive rotting, rendering the life-saving equipment completely useless. Life jackets also turned to dust in the desperate fingers of the panicking passengers. For most on board, there was no escape. The fire raged. The ship ran aground, but the current pulled it loose again. Smoke blackened the sky. From the shore, horrified onlookers watched as the General Slocum, a floating Inferno, drifted out into the deeper water and began to sink. The General Slocum was built with grandeur in mind, a proud symbol of New York's bustling excursion industry at the turn of the 20th century. Launched in 1891, she was a sidewheel paddle steamer designed specifically for leisurely day trips along the waters of the East River and Long Island Sound. Measuring 250 feet in length and 37.5 feet in width, she was large for her class, featuring 3 decks, spacious saloons, and a capacity of over 2,500 passengers. Her hull, built from white oak and yellow pine, was reinforced with iron strapping, a common practice in shipbuilding at the time, though it provided little fire resistance. She was outfitted with 250 electric lights and constructed with 3 watertight compartments in case of flooding. Commissioned by the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company, the General Slocum's construction was split between multiple firms. Her hull was built by Divine Burtis Jr., a well-regarded Brooklyn boat builder, while her upper works were completed by Johnny Hoffmeyer and Son. Her power came from a W&A Fletcher Company steam engine, a single-cylinder, surface-condensing vertical beam marvel with a 53-inch bore and a 12-foot stroke, ensuring steady propulsion through New York's waterways. Steam was provided by 2 boilers operating at a working pressure of 52 pounds per square inch. The ship's paddle wheels, each 31 feet in diameter with 26 paddles, enabled her to reach a top speed of 16 knots. Designed more for comfort and speed, she was built to navigate the calmer waters of the New York Harbor and its tributary rivers. For nearly 13 years, the General Slocum carried out routine excursions, primarily ferrying large groups to destinations along the New York waterfront. She regularly ran up the East River, stopping at Randall's Island, North Brother Island, and various picnic grounds along Long Island Sound. Early in the season, she was available for private charters, often reserved months in advance for a lump sum. As summer peaked, she shifted to the popular Rockaway route, ferrying eager crowds to the sandy shores of Rockaway Beach. Though licensed for 2,500 passengers, overcrowding was common. A standard voyage required a crew of 22, including the captain, engineers, deckhands, and stewards. Despite her reputation as a staple of summer recreation, the General Slocum was no stranger to mishaps. Only 4 months after her launch in 1891, she ran aground off Rockaway Beach, requiring tugboats to pull her free. 3 years later, in 1894, she suffered multiple incidents, including running aground on a sandbar on July 29th while carrying nearly 4,700 passengers, almost double her designed capacity. The following month, she ran aground again, this time off Coney Island during a storm, forcing her passengers to be transferred to another vessel. Later that year, in September, she wouldn't run aground but would collide with the tug R.T. Sayer in the East River, sustaining damage to her steering. The mishaps continued. In July 1898, the General Slocum collided with the steamer Amelia near Battery Park. On August 17, 1901, she became the scene of a near mutiny when a riot broke out among nearly 900 intoxicated anarchists from Paterson, New Jersey. The crew fought to maintain control, and the captain was forced to dock at a police pier, where officers arrested 17 passengers. In June 1902, she ran aground once again, this time with 400 passengers aboard, leaving them stranded overnight. By 1904, the once proud General Slocum was showing her age. Despite fresh paint and routine maintenance, structural weaknesses persisted. Her captain, 67-year-old William Van Schaak, had helmed the vessel for years and was approaching retirement. The Knickerbocker Steamboat Company, her owner, had been struggling financially, having paid no dividends to shareholders in at least 6 years. Yet demand for excursion steamers remained high, and the General Slocum continued to set sail, unaware that her name would soon be synonymous with tragedy. By the early 20th century, German Americans were one of the most established immigrant groups in the United States. Migration from German-speaking regions had been steady since the colonial period, with the first significant waves arriving in the 1670s. Seeking religious freedom, economic opportunity, and open land, German immigrants initially settled in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New York City. But by the 19th century, a new surge of migration swept in, driven by poverty, political unrest, and the failed revolutions of 1848. While many settled in the Midwest as farmers, New York City became home to one of the largest German-speaking enclaves in the country, Kleindeutschland, or Little Germany. Located in what is now the East Village, Little Germany was once the heart of German-American life in New York. By the late 19th century, it was the third largest German-speaking community in the world, behind only Berlin and Vienna. The neighborhood stretched from Division Street in the south to 14th Street in the north, and from the Bowery to Avenue D, forming a dense, bustling cultural hub. At its peak, nearly 250,000 German immigrants and their descendants lived here, creating a self-sustaining world complete with German-language schools, businesses, theaters, social clubs, and churches. Bustling with skilled artisans, factory workers, and small business owners, Kleindeutschland thrived as a city within a city, a place where dreams of prosperity took root and German traditions endured. Kleindeutschland's social fabric was tightly woven around its many Vereins, German social and benevolent clubs that offered everything from professional networking to recreation. Singing societies like the Liederkranz and Aryan clubs reflected the German love of music, while shooting clubs, gymnastic societies, and choral groups provided entertainment and camaraderie. Churches played a central role in community life, particularly Lutheran congregations like St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, which served as both a religious and cultural anchor. The neighborhood's beer halls and restaurants, many of which popularized lager in America, served as gathering places where politics, music, and daily life intertwined. Tompkins Square Park, known to the residents as the Weiße Garten, was a central public space where German families gathered to relax and socialize. Though assimilation was inevitable, the people of Kleindeutschland held fast to cherished traditions. Among the most beloved was the annual church picnic, a tradition dating back to 1887, when St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church began organizing summer excursions. Each year, families escape the city's stifling tenements for the fresh air of Long Island's Locust Grove, reveling in music, games, and the comfort of familiar customs. The event, now in its 17th year, was a highlight of the community's calendar, offering families a chance to enjoy music, games, and traditional German food in a green setting. For many, it was more than just a day of leisure. It was a reaffirmation of identity, a brief escape where the traditions of the old world could flourish in the new. But on a June morning in 1904, this beloved tradition would take a devastating turn. The fate of over 1,300 German Americans would become forever entwined with the ill-fated General Slocum. Chartered by St. Mark's for $350, the ship was meant to ferry them to their beloved picnic grounds on Long Island, but would never make it. The morning of June 15, 1904 was one of excitement and anticipation. Hundreds of German-American families, dressed in their Sunday best, gathered at the East 3rd Street Pier in Manhattan. Mothers held their children's hands, fathers carried picnic baskets, and groups of teenagers laughed as they filed onto the General Slocum. Pastor George Haas had organized the yearly excursion as a celebration for the end of the Sunday school year, offering the congregation a respite from the crowded, sweltering streets of Kleindeutschland. Because Wednesday was a workday for most men, the passengers were primarily women and children. The General Slocum was scheduled to depart at 8 a.m., but was delayed when two families, citing a premonition of disaster the night before, quickly disembarked at the last minute. At approximately 9:30 a.m., the ship finally left the dock. As it pulled away and began its slow journey up the East River, the mood on board was jubilant. A brass band played on the main deck, children ran between the rows of benches, and older women settled in to gossip. The water shimmered in the morning light, and from the decks, passengers watched as the city passed by, tenements, factories, and tugboats chugging alongside them. Yet beneath this picturesque outing, catastrophe loomed. The General Slocum, a wooden relic well past its prime, carried hidden dangers. Lifeboats fused in place with layers of paint, fire hoses left brittle and untested. The ship's safety drills had been neglected, and its life preservers, many over a decade old, were filled with dry-rotted cork or even iron weights disguised as buoyant material. Around 10 a.m., a fire broke out in the forward cabin, a storage area filled with barrels of packing hay, oil-soaked rags, and flammable paint. The precise cause remains unknown, but a discarded match or cigarette likely ignited the blaze. Wisps of black smoke curled from below deck. Crew members, unaware of the danger, pried open the hatch, unleashing a blast of oxygen that fed the hungry flames, turning the smoldering fire into a raging inferno. When a deckhand attempted to douse the flames, the ship's rotten fire hose fell apart in his hands. The crew, poorly trained and unprepared for such an emergency, panicked. In desperation, they tried smothering the flames with charcoal. By the time Captain William Van Schaick was alerted, nearly 10 minutes later, the fire had already transformed into an unstoppable inferno. He later testified that attempting to fight the fire was like trying to put out hell itself. Instead of immediately grounding the ship at one of the nearby landings, Van Schaick ordered full speed ahead, hoping to reach North Brother Island. The increased speed fanned the flames throughout the ship, forcing terrified passengers to the ship's stern. There they found the lifeboats were wired and painted in place, rendering them useless. Those who managed to grab life jackets quickly discovered they were rotten and useless, many filled with iron bars to meet weight requirements. Mothers strapped the faulty life preservers onto their children and tossed them into the river, only to watch in horror as they sank beneath the waves. As flames engulfed the decks, panic set in. Survivors recalled a desperate stampede as passengers trampled each other trying to escape. The wooden hurricane deck, weakened by the fire, collapsed under the weight of hundreds, plunging scores of people into the river. Some were battered by the still-turning paddle wheels, others drowned, dragged down by the weight of their heavy wool clothing. Worse still, most Americans in the early 20th century never learned to swim, turning the river into a graveyard. At 10:20 a.m., the General Slocum ran aground at North Brother Island, now a smoldering wreck. Nurses and staff from the island's hospital rushed to the shore to assist, forming human chains to pull survivors from the water. Tugboats arrived to help, rescuing between 200 and 350 people. But for many, it was too late. The ship, still burning, broke free from the shore and drifted back into the current, finally sinking in the shallow waters off Hunt's Point. In the days that followed, the East River bore silent witness to unspeakable loss. Its waters transformed into a floating graveyard. Rescue workers pulled bodies from the water for weeks. The final death toll reached over 1,000, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in American history. The Lower East Side, once the heart of German-American life in New York, was shattered. Over 600 families mourned a lost child, a mother, a sister. Unable to bear the weight of shared grief, many abandoned the neighborhood altogether. By year's end, Little Germany was little more than a memory. Public outrage followed. Investigations revealed that the General Slocum safety inspections had been riddled with corruption. 8 people were indicted, including Captain Van Schaick, 2 inspectors, and executives of the Knickerbocker Steamship Company. Van Schaick was convicted of criminal negligence for failing to maintain fire drills and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served 3 years before being pardoned by President William Howard Taft in 1912. The Knickerbocker Steamship Company paid a relatively small fine despite evidence of falsified inspection records. However, the disaster led to sweeping reforms in maritime safety regulations, many of which remain in place today. The wreck was eventually refloated, stripped of its charred remains, and converted into a barge named Maryland. But fate wasn't done with the General Slocum. In 1911, caught in a storm off the Atlantic coast, it sank one final time, lost beneath the waves just as the memory of the tragedy faded from public consciousness. The General Slocum disaster remains one of New York's most harrowing tragedies, yet time has dulled its memory. In Tompkins Square Park, a marble fountain stands in silent testimony, its inscription fading. They are Earth's purest children, young and fair. A century later, the voices of those lost have gone quiet. The last known survivor, Adela Witherspoon, passed away in 2004 at the age of 100. With her, the final living thread to that fateful day was severed. Though overshadowed by more recent tragedies, the General Slocum disaster endures in whispers of history, a grim reminder of how quickly joy can turn to horror on the waters of the East River. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end of the video. If you found this story interesting and want to explore other historical people, places, and events, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. I'd also love to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me which topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes. I'm trying to build a community around these videos, so any thoughts on topics or ways to improve the videos are more than welcome. Your support makes this channel possible, and I'm so excited to continue sharing incredible stories with you.